So in this video, I want to briefly introduce biblical criticism, explain what it is, its methods, and then give a few examples. So thank you for joining me in this. But first, before I get into that, I'd like to say that there is no reason why a critical approach to the Bible needs to be seen as a threat to faith or as a contradiction to faith. Personally, I'm a proponent of what Friedrich Schleiermacher described as the eternal covenant that exists between faith and science. He wrote that a living Christian faith and a completely free, independent scientific inquiry have no reason to be in contradiction. Rather, faith does not hinder science, and science does not exclude faith. Now, this is an insight that is important for me in kind of how I think about the natural world and think about science in general, but also faith in general. But I think it's extremely relevant to bring up when we talk about biblical criticism, because often the phrase is that the tendency, especially among conservative thinkers, is that biblical criticism, a critical reading of the scriptures, and faith are in some way in contradiction with each other. But I'm going to present here a understanding of biblical criticism, which is based on a scientific inquiry into the scriptures, and in that sense has no reason to be contradictory to faith. And so with all that in mind, let's ask what biblical criticism is. Biblical criticism is a scholarly approach to the Bible that uses critical tools of textual, historical, and linguistic analysis to understand and explain the text. It typically is divided into two different approaches, one that examines the historical and cultural background behind the text, and another that uses literary, linguistic, and structural methods to critically investigate the text itself. And so these are sometimes called higher criticism and lower criticism, or historical criticism and textual criticism. Now, the higher criticism investigates the world behind the text. That's why it's linked with historical criticism. It looks at kind of the historical background, the archaeological record, and all of that, the cultural background that exists behind these texts, whereas lower criticism focuses on the text itself and is sometimes divided into various methods such as source criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism, and others. And so these two approaches are generally what make up the field of biblical scholarship or biblical criticism. And so there are also recent approaches that are a little bit more new to biblical scholarship, and these are sometimes called the advocacy criticism, which includes readings such as feminist, post-colonialist, and liberationist readings of the text. But it's important to note, really, for all of these differences and different methods, whether it's higher or lower criticism, is that at its core, biblical criticism is a scientific and scholarly endeavor. As such, biblical criticism lays the groundwork for an interpretation of the Bible, but at its core, it is a scholarly discipline. And so that's important to clarify because one of the misconceptions about biblical criticism is that it is ideologically based and that it is predisposed to exclude faith, to deny faith, or in some way to contest faith. When actually the opposite is the case. Most often there's an ideological bias that causes conservatives or evangelicals to just outright reject the results of biblical criticism, even though they are rooted in a sound scholarly approach and scholarly method. They are just presenting the results of a critical analysis. But for example, a biblical critic can very well have faith in Jesus Christ, but in doing their critical research, they suspend that faith in the particular dogmas of the church while they try to investigate the text of Scripture so that they can arrive at a scholarly understanding of it, and no longer one that is just purely based on their own biases and presuppositions. And so that is a necessary step to take in order to avoid any of this bias that can then skew the findings of critical research. And so what I want to stress is that this critical approach is not ideologically predisposed to disprove or fight against faith. Rather, faith is not the object of this sort of research. We do not have faith in a text or in the background of the text or in a particular reading of a text. Those are things that are part of interpretation, but that's not our faith. Our faith is in Jesus Christ as Lord. And so the results of critical reading of the Bible have no need to be a threat to faith. But on the other hand, faith should not feel like it needs to contradict the results of scholarship. But that's typically what happens ideologically with the more conservative or evangelical pushback against biblical criticism. They push back on the basis of some kind of dogma and say that we will reject the results of this scholarship because of their presupposed faith. Now, another misconception is that biblical criticism is inherently critical in the sense that it takes a negative posture against the text. But criticism here is really just the term meaning scholarly or scientific. You should think biblical criticism in the same way you think of literary criticism. Somebody can do literary criticism, say, of James Joyce's works, or of somebody else's, an important literary scholar will look at Shakespeare, for example. But by doing literary criticism, they're not necessarily making a value judgment about the text. That's not at all what's taking place. Rather, criticism just involves the scholarly dimension of reading a text. And so I think that's a helpful thing to kind of clarify here. Now, what's an example then of biblical criticism? We've talked about the two different forms. I'll give first the textual version of textual criticism, and then towards the end I'll look at a historical criticism. And so one of the most common questions that a biblical critical approach will ask is the question of authorship. Who actually wrote the text? And so there is a tradition that says this person wrote the text, and maybe the text even claims it was written by that person. But then the critical approach is going to be suspicious of that claim, and they're going to try to ascertain who actually wrote the text. And so the classic example is the investigation into the Pauline epistles. Main reason why some of these biblical scholars are skeptical of a text claiming to be written by Paul is because it was actually really common in the ancient Near East to do this, to write under somebody else's name. And maybe it's because you were inspired by that person, maybe you learned from this person, or you were one of their disciples. And so it was super common to write under somebody else's name as kind of an homage to that person. And so when it comes to Paul, the undisputed letters, the ones that most scholars agree were written by Paul, include 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and Romans. But the disputed texts are Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and the pastoral epistles of 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. And so that's the general consensus. There's, of course, debate within scholarship. There's always checks and balances. It's never, it's not a dogma. They're looking at trying to revise these ideas based on the data and the research that's done. And so the question then is, what do we do with this information? We can either ignore the scholarly research, and we can claim just dogmatically that Paul wrote all of these texts that are ascribed to him, such as Ephesians, but it leads me to wonder why. We really have no reason to do that and to claim that Paul had to have written Ephesians, because it can still remain important and will still remain important for faith whether or not Paul wrote the text. We're not necessarily asking the question of whether or not the text should be canon. It is canon, that's established, it's in the New Testament, and so therefore it is important for the life of the church, it's important for faith and for theology, and it can't just be discredited because it's no longer Pauline. But rather, it does give us some important insight into the nature of Ephesians as a book, or any of these other texts as a book. And so biblical criticism, it's often argued, is a ideologically motivated endeavor to cut out parts of the Bible that we don't like, or something like that. But that's just not the case of what biblical criticism is trying to do. There's nobody that's trying to say, because Ephesians wasn't written by Paul, we don't need to deal with it as a text. We don't need to critically engage with it. We don't need to figure out what it means. Rather, it gives us insight into the nature of Ephesians and how then that can lend towards interpretation. And so it's actually very much the opposite, where kind of the more conservative or evangelical reaction against biblical criticism is the one that reacts against it and rejects it based on an ideological presupposition. But that's a faulty assumption about what faith is. Faith doesn't necessarily have to be a literal thing where we literally believe that Paul wrote Ephesians or else our entire faith is destroyed. It can be something that accepts that there is a historical precedence for somebody writing in somebody else's name, for example, or that there's some disputed aspects of certain texts, right? In the case of like form or source criticism, And that doesn't necessarily mean that faith no longer has an interest in these, or it doesn't, or can take anything away from it, but rather it just changes the nature of our understanding so that we can then interpret, I think, with a little bit more of a scholarly approach. And so if Paul didn't write Ephesians, it really doesn't matter. The text is important still for faith and theology. And so this is just one example of the form of biblical criticism known as textual criticism. One of the main arguments against Ephesians being authentically Pauline is that there are certain words in the Greek that are used in that text that are never used in the authentic letters of Paul. And so there seems to be a different author at work here. And so that's a textual criticism that's involved in this debate about the Pauline authorship. There's also historical considerations that go into it, and the timeline and the dating of the text and all of these things. But that's kind of where this version is coming from, and so that's the example of a lower criticism, of textual criticism. There's obviously a number of other examples that can be found in the New Testament, especially, but that's one of the more classic ones worth considering. Now, the other side of things is the higher criticism that I mentioned, and this is the historical criticism of the Bible. And I think for me, an interesting example of this is the destruction of the Canaanites in Joshua 10. This is an account which is undoubtedly one of the most troubling and difficult texts in the Bible to deal with, where it's said that God commanded Israel to destroy and effectively genocide the Canaanite people. But historical criticism, which again looks at behind the text, looks at the world behind the text, what was going on historically, culturally, and all of that. The results of historical criticism have investigated this and have come to, I think, somewhat of an insightful realization. The archaeological evidence that has looked into this has suggested that there actually was no genocide of the Canaanites, but rather it's most likely, I've read different accounts, but it's most likely that the Canaanite people and the Israelite people just coexisted and eventually merged into one people. There's some debates about that, of course, but there's no real archaeological evidence of this violent destruction of the Canaanites, this just total annihilation of their people. And so that is something that's almost unquestioned within the archaeological evidence. And so the Old Testament scholar Peter Enns summarizes this very well. He writes, "Biblical archaeologists are about as certain as you can be about these things that the conquest of Canaan, as the Bible describes, did not happen. No mass invasion from the outside by an Israelite army, and no extermination of the Canaanites as God commanded. This bit of information may feel like pipes bursting down into your living room, but stay with it. It may wind up being a bit of unexpected good news." So again, we ask the question, what do we do with this information? If this is the result of a scholarly approach to archaeology and to the Bible, then what do we do with it? So either we take the biblical literist approach, which simply rejects the results of this research, and we call it false because it doesn't fit within our ideological assumptions about what historical means in the Bible. Or we accept the results of science and use that as the basis for a fresh interpretation of the text, one which is no longer rooted in ideological claims, but in a research that no longer excludes faith. And so that research can then become a basis for a new interpretation. And I think for me, this is a helpful example for how biblical criticism can actually be extremely insightful when it comes to how we interpret the Bible. There are numerous theological and ethical reasons why it is actually good news to learn that the genocide of the Canaanites did not take place historically. I think this is one of the most troubling stories in the Bible, certainly at least in the Hebrew Bible, but it actually is a little bit of a relief to learn that this didn't take place historically. Now, that doesn't mean that Joshua should be cut out of the Bible, nor does it mean that we need to discount the text and just push it aside and not deal with it anymore. The Bible can still be considered by us inspired and authoritative, even if we no longer accept that it was literal, if we accept the results of historical criticism. And so the only difference now is that we're asking a different question. We're no longer assuming that the historical presentation in Joshua is a literal history in the sense that we think of it today as moderns. And in the modern time, we have a certain concept of what historical means that didn't exist in the minds of the authors of Joshua. And so we cannot take our assumptions and push it onto the text and say that historical has to mean literal, when that's not necessarily the case for the authors of Joshua even. They weren't necessarily aware of those sort of presuppositions about what means history. And so all of this is then insightful for how we look at the text in a fresh way. And so what we're now asking is, why did the authors of Joshua feel it was necessary to present the history of Israel in this particular way, in the sense of conquest and all of that? And what does that mean for their understanding of God and how they relate to God and the land and to their nation and all of that? So there can still be a lot of powerful insights that come out of this. It may involve Israel's national identity, which is an important point in the Hebrew Scriptures, and also their relationship with the land, the relationship as the chosen people of God. And so the story in some regard speaks of of God's faithfulness to Israel, even if it uses a bit of a fictionalized violence to relay that message. But it presents this image of God being the one who inspires to conquer their enemy, to overcome difficulties, all of these things, and it reestablishes God's relationship to Israel as being the chosen people. And so while there's not necessarily agreement on the date about the book of Joshua, one possibility here is that this text was written during the period of Babylonian exile. And so it makes a lot of sense of people that are struggling under oppression, that are struggling from a loss of their homeland, to tell each other this story in a way to encourage that national identity of God who helps them conquer the land and take their homeland. And so it makes a lot of sense, actually, that this text would be important because it reaffirms God's relationship and God's faithfulness to Israel. And that's, of course, conjecture. It's not certain that this was written during that time, but it's a possible reading. And so that's just an example of maybe some of the different interpretations that can come out of historical criticism that takes that as its basis, and then also still deals with the text as an inspired text that has meaning for not only the people of Israel at that time, but it can have meaning for us still today. And so what this does is it helps us kind of get away from the very literalist interpretation of the text, and that where we force it to be literal and historical and black and white in the way that we expect it to be, and rather we let the text be what it is. And I think what we do is we put a disservice on the text when we force it to be how we expect it to be. We force it to be literal. We say Genesis has to be a scientific textbook about the creation of the world. Joshua has to be a literal event. But biblical criticism can actually liberate us from our own presumptions about what the Bible is, and it lets the Bible be what it actually truly is. And so in that sense, it can truly help us come to a new foundation for a better interpretation of the text and new meanings that can come from it. And so, like I said, Genesis 1's maybe an interesting example. The early church fathers, especially people like St. Origen, read the Bible allegorically, and in many regards that can be a helpful approach for us today, particularly when it comes to Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is written as theological poetry that has more to do with God and the nature of God and the relation of God with creation than it does in the sense of a scientific textbook that has to be literally forced into our minds and in a way that contradicts like evolution or the age of the earth, whatever else. And so we truly let Genesis 1 wanted to be what it is when we don't force it into this sort of reductionistic literist reading, and we let it be theological poetry. And there's a lot of beauty that can come from that, and the interpretation can then be quite helpful. And so I hope this video has been a helpful one to you. I wanted to do two things. I wanted to introduce biblical criticism as a concept, both the higher and the lower form of criticism. That example from Joshua is an example of higher criticism that looks at the world behind the text, particularly archaeological evidence here. There's a lot of other examples that can be brought out for both and the various different types within both of those divisions. But I hope most of all that I've been able to impress that faith has no reason to be afraid of the results of scientific inquiry, particularly the scholarly investigation into the scriptures, both its world and its textual considerations. And so scientific inquiry does not need to exclude faith, and faith needs not to hinder scientific research. Rather, these can coexist in this eternal covenant, which Schleiermacher called the eternal covenant, and they do not need to be pinned against each other as they perpetually are within some of the more evangelical circles. And so if this is something that's interested you and you want to read more, I do recommend kind of as a good primer, not necessarily the primer, but this is a helpful Bible to pick up. It's called the New Oxford Annotated Bible in the NRSV. It has very good introductions to each book, and it typically does a good job of summarizing some of the general claims that scholars have, or the general insights that scholars have. Like, for example, the introduction to Ephesians says that most scholars do not think Paul wrote this, and they try to date it to some extent and say probably why. And so it does a very good job of that. When it comes to Joshua, it has a very good intro where it says this book shouldn't be read historically. It says that right away and explains why. And so this is a good text to kind of get the overview of like book by book, verse by verse. Sometimes it doesn't always do it for each verse, but the introductions to each book are very, very helpful in this regard. And so I definitely recommend that. I do also recommend Peter Enns' work, not only the book that I quoted from, The Bible Tells Me So, but in many other books by him, including a podcast that he runs on the Bible. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been a helpful and instructive video for you. Let me know if you have any questions about this down below. But like I said, thanks for watching. Have a good day.